Opening up a central pawn immediately challenges black's structure and aims for early kingside development. Developing the knight to its natural square immediately challenges white's central control and prepares for rapid development across the board. Developing the knight now shores up the central pawn structure and prepares for kingside castling. Preparing a fianchetto, black aims to control the long diagonal and fortify their king. Solidifying central control while preparing to expand on the queenside is the immediate aim. Developing the bishop to its most active diagonal solidifies the pawn chain and prepares for castling, a fundamentally sound plan. Solidifying central influence, nc3 prepares for rapid kingside castling and reinforces the pawn chain's integrity. Solidifying the pawn center while opening a diagonal for the bishop is a sound response. Securing the center, this pawn thrust aims for maximum central control and opens diagonals for its bishops. Securing the monarch behind a pawn wall is paramount, a sound decision paving the way for central development and potential counterplay. Solidifying central control, the bishop prepares for an assault on the kingside's shadows. Developing the knight to d7 reinforces the central control and prepares for potential piece exchanges or a queenside expansion. Securing the monarch with castling solidifies white's central presence and prepares for potential pawn advances. Solidifying the pawn chain with c6 shores up the queenside and prepares for a potential e5 break, though it slightly restricts the bishop's scope. Reinforcing the kingside pawn structure prevents any immediate back-rank threats or knight invasions. Unlocking the center with this pawn thrust creates immediate central tension, challenging white's well-placed pieces and opening lines for black's pieces. Reasserting central presence, this bishop development aims to bolster the pawn chain and potentially facilitate an eventual f4 advance. Repositioning the queen streamlines development and bolsters the kingside, preparing for potential pawn advances. Expanding space and gaining a central stronghold, white creates a formidable pawn chain that restricts black's development. Solidifying the pawn chain, this fortifies black's central structure against white's encroaching pieces, though it does concede light square bishop mobility. Pawns now form a compact wall, limiting black's queenside ambitions and preparing a potential kingside advance. Repositioning the knight to the flank opens up a potential kingside attack, but compromises central control. Preparing to deploy the rook to the central fight, bolstering the e-file advance and potentially supporting a kingside pawn push. The knight boldly advances, aiming to disrupt white's central control and perhaps create tactical opportunities on the kingside. Preparing to contest the vital e4 square and potentially activate the bishop along the long diagonal. Propping up the kingside pawn chain solidifies black's structure, preventing a queenside advance from disrupting the defensive setup. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure, though it does create a dark square weakness around the king. Repositioning the knight to the edge might seem passive, but it prepares to reroute it to a more active square or supports a kingside pawn advance. Consolidating influence on the queenside, the rook readies for potential action along the c-file, challenging black's passive setup. Re-establishing the king's safety on a less exposed square, this aims to sidestep potential threats developing on the kingside. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, white aims to shatter black's solid defenses and seize the initiative. Opening the queenside flank establishes potential counterplay, aiming to undermine white's central control and create dynamic pawn structure imbalances. Anchoring the king allows for potential future pawn pushes on the kingside, but delays development. A necessary repositioning to challenge white's queenside expansion and prepare for central action. Unlocking the kingside for a potential attack, though it momentarily weakens the central e5 square. Retreating the knight to g8 sacrifices precious tempo, hindering development and inviting aggressive pawn pushes. The bishop now eyes the weak kingside dark squares, seeking to exploit the h4-d8 diagonal if black's pawn structure falters. Developing the bishop to d7 prepares to exchange it for white's active knight, relieving pressure on black's queenside pawns. Opening the b-file creates immediate dynamic tension, challenging black's pawn structure and preparing potential breakthroughs. Opening lines for your king's knight, aiming to redeploy it to a more active square. Anchoring the bishop on f3 exerts pressure on the queen side and supports the pawn majority, aiming to restrict black's initiative. Reclaiming the knight's outpost is paramount. Its current position on the edge of the board offers no offensive or defensive benefit. Pressuring the queenside pawn chain, this rook claims the open file for a potential breakthrough. This rook repositions, activating a passive piece and preparing to contest the open b-file, potentially creating counterplay. Seeking to activate the beleaguered rook, white aims to challenge black's queenside pawn structure, potentially opening lines for future piece deployment. Bringing the knight back to the central action, aiming to reinforce the kingside and potentially join a queenside pawn push. Reinforcing the b-file rook creates a powerful battery, aiming to exploit the open possibilities down that path. Exchanging rooks opens crucial files and simplifies the position, aiming for a more active endgame for black's queen. Reinforcing the open file and eyeing the queenside pawns, this rook transfer initiates a positional squeeze. Unlocking the f-file seeks to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and create immediate dynamic possibilities. Focusing the queen to pressure the queenside and prepare a kingside thrust against the weakened structure. Initiating a bold pawn push to disrupt white's queenside structure while preparing for a potential pawn storm. Securing the central d4 square and preparing to redeploy the knight to a more active role on the kingside. A subtle shift in white's positional posture. A bold repositioning of the knight, aiming to liberate the kingside and threaten further breakthroughs. This audacious queen sortie probes black's defenses, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and disrupt any nascent counterplay. Initiating pawn liberation across the center, this captures the opportunity to inject dynamism into black's position after white's queen foray. Reclaiming the outpost for the bishop solidifies central control and prepares a more active role for the minor piece. Unleashing the bishop to contest the center and create immediate threats around white's pawn structure. Clearing the central files opens up avenues for piece activity, potentially pressuring black's reshuffled structure. Reclaiming central influence with the knight's hop, this maneuver immediately challenges white's bishop and opens avenues for further piece development. Consolidating the monarch behind pawn cover is a prudent, if passive, defensive adjustment. Shifting the queen allows for a potential regrouping, aiming to reinforce the weak dark squares around white's monarch. Opening the queenside rook file now allows the queen to exert significant pressure on the light squares, forcing black to react defensively. Reorganizing the knight to a more active square, aiming to control the critical e4 outpost and prepare for potential queenside action. A calculated repositioning, this queen probes potential weaknesses while preparing to exploit the open files. The knight's retreat signals a positional concession, allowing white to dominate the queenside and prepare for a kingside assault. Activating the knight to centralize and prepare for potential kingside pressure. Relocating the rook aims to challenge the open files and prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside. Aimed at securing the queenside and creating a potential passed pawn, white establishes a long-term plan to restrict black's pieces. Securing that rook on the 7th rank solidifies control over the critical d-file. The rook vacates the b-file, preparing for a potential queenside pawn push and freeing up queenside space. This knight's redeployment to f7 finally brings it into play, eyeing potential central infiltration or supporting a kingside pawn push. Pushing the pawn forward aims to gain queenside space and potentially open a path for the rook. Unleashing the pawn opens crucial diagonals for your bishops and aims to disrupt white's tightly packed queenside. Re-establishing the rook's presence on the open file aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's remaining pieces. Unleashing the knight towards white's king now, seeking to disrupt the otherwise solid structure. Opening the H-file is a bold gamble, potentially creating weaknesses around your own king while seeking counterplay. Liberating the knight from its defensive post, this move immediately targets the exposed white king and forces concessions. Opening the F-file unleashes a powerful diagonal assault, directly exposing the weakened black king and creating immediate tactical threats. Capturing the bishop dismantles white's central pawn structure, opening diagonals for your remaining pieces. Unleashing the passed pawn along the file aims to fracture black's defenses and force a concession. A desperate attempt to unblock the pinned bishop, sacrificing piece safety for potential counterplay. Reactivating the queen's pressure on the c-file will make it difficult for black to consolidate his position. Shifting the bishop to b4 aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay. Reclaiming the central files and preparing to activate the rook after black's bishop has gone astray. Shifting the queen to the queenside aims to contest the open files and potentially tie down white's pieces. Activating the rook along the central file now aims to dislodge black's entrenched bishop and challenge the queen. Seeking active counterplay, black injects a pawn into white's territory, aiming to disrupt the queenside structure. Repositioning the rook to the open file asserts pressure and prepares for potential king-side advances. The rook's relocation to the 7th rank aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay on the open file. Unearthing your king from its cozy shelter invites complications. The pawn storm is brewing on the kingside. The bishop bravely ventures to the front, hoping to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. Preparing to contest the open f-file and bolster the central pawn structure with a solid advance. The bishop retreats, seeking better squares and avoiding the immediate threats, while white consolidates its attacking structure. A tactical reshuffle of white's rook to a more active square on the 7th rank, seeking to exploit black's somewhat passive piece placement. Unleashing the king's defense, black aims to disrupt white's rook on the file and create counterplay. Restoring a knight to its central post signals a shift towards solidifying the kingside and preparing for a more positional struggle. Seeking a safe haven, the king ventures towards the queenside's relative security amidst white's encroaching pawns and rooks. Consolidating queenside pressure with a potential battery along the b-file. Seeking refuge for the monarch, this maneuver aims to secure a safer position amidst the encroaching enemy forces. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to support advances or exploit weaknesses. Seeking to solidify the queen's influence and prepare for potential kingside pressure. Unleashing a king's assault, this check aims to pry open the defender's structure and exploit the exposed monarch. The queen seeks a safer haven, but the potential for a discovered attack looms large on the dark squares. Offering the queen to force an exchange simplifies things dramatically, potentially heading towards an endgame where white might have an edge. The black queen retreats to a defensive square, allowing white's king to enjoy a moment of safety, but it relinquishes the attacking potential it previously held. Repositioning the queen offers a final chance to force a draw by repetition, an attempt to escape a losing endgame. Sensing a desperate attempt to reposition the bishop for defense or a latent counterattack along the 3rd rank. Seizing the d-file opens a dangerous diagonal for the queen, potentially threatening the exposed black king. Sacrificing the bishop offers a brief respite, but the pawns are critically exposed. Exploiting the undefended bishop is paramount, securing a decisive material advantage. Sensing white's king might be exposed after the pawn exchange, black challenges the open files to exploit the lingering weaknesses. Unlocking the central files offers attacking opportunities, aiming to exploit black's slightly awkward bishop placement. The rook's relocation to the e7 square aims to contest the vital open file, potentially preparing for a defensive maneuver or counterplay. Unleashing a forcing check to disrupt the enemy king's sanctuary and expose vulnerabilities. Probing the queen trade to clarify the complex middle game structure, hoping to simplify into a favorable endgame. Pushing the pawn cracks open the queenside for a decisive invasion. Giving up the queen in this position signals a desperate attempt to simplify, but it appears black underestimated white's powerful passed pawn on the d-file. Recapturing the pawn secures white's material advantage and opens the kingside for potential initiative. Abandoning the rook exchange, black aims to redeploy their bishop for active defense. Anchoring the rook here strengthens the grip on the crucial central files and prepares a potential pawn advance, aiming to dismantle black's defensive structure. Shifting the king towards the center in this endgame, preparing to engage in the fight for control of the remaining open files. Knight finds a more active square, eyeing potential pawn breakthroughs or king attacks. Exploring a central outpost for the king could be a strategic gamble here. Snatching the pawn with check exposes the black king, initiating a decisive sequence. The king tentatively steps out, seeking refuge, but the knight's recapture opens dangerous lines for white's pieces. Repositioning the king to safety after the recent exchanges. A desperate attempt to activate the bishop, sacrificing positional harmony for a flicker of counterplay. Centralizing the monarch offers a dynamic escape route from the pawn structure's confines. Initiating a decisive rook check across the board, threatening a swift endgame advantage. This defensive redeployment seeks to consolidate pawns and brace for the impending rook infiltration on the open file. The rook repositions to create a defensive barrier, anticipating a possible advance by white's knight or pawns. Shifting the king aims to bolster its defensive posture amidst the pawns. The rook prepares to slide to the king's flank, aiming to disrupt white's defensive setup and perhaps exploit an exposed king. Snatching the pawn now opens a powerful diagonal for the knight and forces a king retreat. Sacrificing material here seals the king's doom, leaving the monarch exposed to relentless attack. A decisive pawn capture, severing the opponent's remaining attacking threat and simplifying into a winning material advantage. Black's king, now exposed by the material exchange, faces an uphill battle to find safety amidst white's advancing pawns and coordinated pieces. Securing the newly opened file with the rook establishes dominance and prepares for further infiltration into black's weakened position. The rook's retreat to a more active diagonal opens up its attacking potential. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank now actively targets black's weak pawns and prepares for queenside infiltration. Seeking to regroup the king, but the pawn structure is now too compromised. The rook now invades the queenside, aiming to secure the passed pawn and create decisive threats. The king's active journey across the board abruptly halts, surrendering valuable tempo to the advancing rook. Unleashing a decisive fork, this check aims to decimate black's remaining pawn structure and secure a swift material advantage. The king's march is halted, now scrambling to a safer square as the opposition's rook eyes the open column. Pushing this pawn further guarantees it will become a queen, a devastating outcome for black. Initiating pawn advancement on the queenside creates a passed threat, forcing white to react and potentially concede territory. Activating the king by moving it towards the center is a crucial step to join the endgame fight for the remaining pieces. Securing the 7th rank with the rook offers a vital defensive anchor against white's advancing pawn. The rook leaps to a more active file, threatening to cut off the black king and create winning opportunities. The rook's position now guards the a-pawn and prepares to advance, aiming to restrict white's king. Securing the 8th rank with the rook opens up the possibility of further breakthroughs against the black king. The rook now decisively claims the 7th rank, heralding the inevitable pawn promotion. Aggressively pushing the king forward aims to secure the pawn's promotion, a crucial endgame objective. The rook's infiltration to the 7th rank will soon be unstoppable, creating a decisive advantage. The king ventures out, initiating a dangerous chase for the isolated pawn. The rook's relocation offers a final chance to disrupt white's pawn endgame potential. Securing the 7th rank opens a direct path to consolidating material and potentially forcing pawn advances. The king now ventures out, seeking active defense against the oncoming rook advance. Securing the rook on the 6th rank offers substantial counterplay, threatening to infiltrate black's weakened position and gain control of open files. King's active presence is crucial now, forcing the rook to the open file and potentially creating mating threats. King activation is paramount. Marching forward aims to control open files and shepherd the passed pawn. Initiating a final defensive retreat to centralize the rook behind the pawn chain, preparing for the inevitable endgame. Securing the final pawn on the kingside solidifies white's decisive material advantage. The black king, exposed and vulnerable on the kingside, now faces increased pressure with this repositioning. Repositioning the rook to the 6th rank solidifies control over open lines and prepares for a decisive pawn advance. Securing the king's safety is paramount as the rooks become active adversaries in this endgame. The monarch now seeks the sanctuary of the kingside, aiming to evade further threats and prepare for the final phase of the endgame. Seeking to consolidate and prepare for a swift king sortie. Activating the g-pawn offers a pawn sacrifice to potentially open lines and attack the exposed black monarch. Forcing the white king to a vulnerable square, this rook check initiates a final aggressive surge. Unleashing the rook to dominate the 7th rank, a bold stride towards securing victory. King's migration to safety from the king's rook's influence marks a strategic shift. Unleashing a decisive pawn thrust to seal the king's fate and initiate the final push toward victory. The rook abandons its defensive post, potentially inviting disaster as the white king infiltrates the weakened queenside. Seizing the open file to threaten perpetual check or force further material concessions. Consolidating the pieces on the queenside is a wise decision with the opposing king exposed. The monarch scrambles for safety, hoping to evade the menacing rook and pawn endgame. Securing the king's escape route to the g-file, a prudent defensive maneuver in this tense endgame. Pushing the pawn forward creates a significant threat to the black king's safety. The rook's charge forces the king into an exposed position on the 7th rank, a decisive territorial surrender. Unleashing the king into the heart of the action is a bold endgame maneuver. The king's escape route is now blocked, leaving him vulnerable to immediate threats. Unleashing the rook forces the black king to an exposed square, setting up a decisive mating net. Initiating a royal retreat from the dangerous open lines after the bishop's sacrifice. Initiating a decisive king march towards the center, preparing to support the passed pawn and hunt down black's remaining pieces. This unexpected check forces white to reveal his king further, offering black a dynamic opportunity to disrupt the opposing forces. Unleashing the king's potential for the final charge, a bold gambit in this endgame phase. The king is now forced to retreat, surrendering vital space and allowing black's rook to dominate the 7th rank. Unleashing the king into open space, seeking central dominion. Harnessing the initiative, the rook slides into a potent attacking posture, aiming to dismantle white's defenses. Opening the king's escape route, the rook mobilizes, preparing to escort the pawns forward towards promotion.